about St. Francis and his whole relationship with war and peace, what it means to be a peacemaker, a little bit from the Franciscan tradition. And I actually want to start with an article from the rule that I follow, the rule that I'm vowed to. It's made of a compilation of quotes from various texts that St. Francis wrote. And it says, "As they announce peace with their lips, let them be careful to have it even more within their own hearts. No one should be roused to wrath or insult on their account. Rather, all should be moved to peace, goodwill, and mercy because of their gentleness. The sisters and brothers are called to heal the wounded, to bind up those who are bruised, and to reclaim the erring. Wherever they are, they should recall that they have given themselves up completely and handed themselves over totally to our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, they should be prepared to expose themselves to every enemy, visible and invisible, for love of him. Because the Lord says, 'Blessed are they who suffer persecution for the sake of justice. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven.'" And I think that peace is something that we all desire. Peace is something that we all long for and are hungry for. And it was adopted as St. Francis' greeting. From the time that he left the world, he always said, "May the Lord give you peace," when he greeted, which is a Middle Eastern greeting, so it's a beautiful thing that we share, that greeting of peace. And I think it was a special gift entrusted to Francis for the sake of the world, this gift of peace. But we have to ask, what is peace? And obviously a negative definition isn't going to be enough. Peace isn't an absence of war. Peace is a good. It has to have substance to it. It has to have weight and meat. And the definition that I kind of propose is for peace, especially from the perspective of St. Francis, is that peace is the radical assent to God's will as it's manifest in the reality of our lives. And I propose as synonyms for peace, poverty, obedience, and empty love. It's something that's not really noted very much, but when St. Francis was asking for the privilege of poverty for his community, what won the day for him in that argument was this. He told the bishop, "Bishop, if we own things, then we have to defend them." And the bishop said, "You're right." Because any kind of ownership can end up leading to war of one kind or another. And I think that that's not just ownership of things, that's also ownership of ideas, it's ownership of even your own ego. So I just want to look now at the trajectory of Francis's life and how he arrived at peace, how he arrived at that place. And I think that the thing is, Francis had a lot of war in his life. I think we may not really all know that. A lot of people don't know very much about the actual facts of Francis's life. But even when he was a teenager, he may have been involved in the overthrowing of the nobility in Assisi. So even when he was a teen, he probably was involved in that in some way. But we know for sure that he was involved in the battle at Collestrata against the neighboring town of Perugia. And it turned into a bloodbath, this battle between these two city-states, and Francis was on the losing side. It ended up that the only people whose lives were spared were those who had money enough to be ransomed, and that was just told by how they were outfitted. So Francis was wealthy enough to be ransomed, so he wasn't killed, but he would have seen people hacked to pieces on the battlefield that day. And he was 21 years old, so he was a young man. And he saw death. And not only did he see death, he was then taken as a prisoner of war in horrible conditions for a year. He saw death and he felt death in his own flesh. He was really, really sick. He could have died. And all I could think of as I was meditating on this episode in his life is something Gandhi said. He said, "Nonviolence cannot be taught to a person who fears to die." Francis had been taken through the point of fearing death to the other side. It's something he had faced and was willing to confront, and I think that that's part of his path towards peace, was through this horrible battle at Collestrata. He assented radically to the death that he witnessed, because he couldn't do anything about it. He assented to the suffering in his own flesh. He assented to the humiliation, the sadness. So another moment where Francis comes towards peace is the famous scene where he kisses the leper. Again, this is a kind of violent encounter in some sense, because Francis had a violent repulsion to lepers. He hated them. Even if he could see the compound where they lived, he would plug up his nose and turn the other way. He was completely repulsed. But there was grace one day for him to move past that and to see Christ in the leper. He dismounted from his horse, he kisses the leper, and here again, he has another thing taken away from him. He doesn't have his fear of death anymore, and now he doesn't have this fear of the shame of leprosy. He doesn't have a fear of the sickness. He doesn't have a fear of the embarrassment, the social status problems that arose from leprosy. He's stripped of that. He's stripped of all that in this encounter with the leper. And here he assents to the pain that the leper feels. He assents to that reality present. The next place we see is his stripping before the bishop. Another famous scene, right? Francis is called before the bishop as an ecclesial court. His father says, "You've got to give me everything that I gave you." And he says, "Okay." And he strips completely naked and gives everything to his father. And this seems kind of like not peaceful, right? It seems like again, kind of a violent action on Francis's part, or an opposition to his father. But actually, I think that by renouncing everything his father gave him, Francis took down a wall that was still there between him and his father. All the material goods that he had taken and squandered from his father, it was like a wall between them. And now the wall is gone. The path for reconciliation is open. Was it achieved? Not that we have ever heard, but by his poverty, by his stripping of that thing he was attached to, Francis opened the path for peace. And then moving closer to our subject at hand here, when he goes to the Crusaders' camp, this is during the Fifth Crusade, a very horrible and prolonged ordeal. I think that Francis would have been stripped there of any vainglory he might have felt about Christendom and the state of affairs in his own culture. Seeing the Crusaders who were sworn to, defend the faith or to promote the cause of Christendom, seeing them just whoring and pillaging and being rather brutal in their conduct and even in the way they were waging the war, I think that would have taken away any last inkling of romance in battle that he may have held onto from his youth. There was a stripping there. And I think, just from what I've read and prayed with over these weeks in preparation, I think that when Francis met the Sultan, his heart was broken. Because he gives the only thing he has to give. He gives his preaching of Christ crucified, and it's what he bore closest to his heart. And what he wants doesn't happen, right? The Sultan isn't converted. There's a deep respect that's born there. But respect, I think, can be present with a broken heart. When we love something or someone, we want everyone to share that love. I feel that way about stupid things, right? Like, I want everyone to love running. I don't know why, just because I like it, right? And so when we come to the matters closest to our hearts, it's deeply painful when someone that we respect and care for doesn't share that. So I really think that when Francis preached before the Sultan, this kind man who treated him well, I think it must have broken his heart that he didn't become Christian. And that Francis doesn't even become a martyr. Here he lays down his life, and it's not even taken. Oh, the pain of that, right? How often do we do that? I will give it up, right? And so often the things we want to sacrifice aren't even what God wants for us. Finally, the last point is when Francis returned to Italy, he came back to a completely broken order. Again, his own brothers had deserted the ideals that he had established for them. They were falling away from his desires for them. His own children, as he called them, had left his heart, had left the protective love that he had offered them. And I think that in this empty love, in this poverty, in this ascent to what was, Francis became the father and the brother of his brothers and of all of us, I think I can say, in a new way. Because he shared in God the Father's helpless love for us. And this was most seen, I think, when he receives the stigmata, which is after all this happens. He comes back, he's in prayer, in sorrow at Mount Laverna, and he receives the stigmata, the marks of Christ. He has holes in his hands, in his feet, and in his heart. He has a physically broken and empty heart from that point on. And I think that in this, he's marked with the brands of Christ. That's what St. Paul says, and then it's taken up by the Franciscans. I've been, henceforth, let no man trouble me. I've been marked with the brands of Christ. And brands designate ownership. Francis doesn't even own himself at this point. He doesn't own his life. He doesn't own any things. He owns nothing. In this, he's conformed to Christ, who was also totally poor on the cross. And this is, I think, the deepest encounter that Francis has with Christ is through this conformity to him. It's not in a face-to-face meeting, but in an enfleshment of Christ that Francis comes closest to him. And I think that this pierced heart of Francis and this pierced heart of Jesus is sort of an icon of peace for us. Peace, as I said at the beginning, is an empty love. And I just quickly want to run through a few features of empty love. Empty love is committed love. Not only is Francis' heart pierced, but his hands and his feet bear the nail wounds of Jesus. The nails signify a commitment. He's not leaving that place. He's not leaving the Sultan and his love for him and his commitment to him. He's not leaving his brothers. He's not leaving the Crusaders, even. He's not leaving any of these people. It's a committed love. His empty love is nonviolent because it has nothing to defend. Francis does not have himself to defend. The only thing he desires is to preach Christ crucified, and Christ crucified has already made himself defenseless. We don't need to defend Jesus. He has exposed himself already on the cross. Empty love is gentle love. When I was first coming into community, my formator would often tell me, gentleness, Sister Agnes Thérèse, strength under control. Strength under control, and it's kind of wound its way into my brain. Francis has a strength that's under control. It's held captive to Christ. And finally, empty love, again, is the love of a broken heart. Francis' heart must have been broken by all of these painful encounters that we've gone through. But it's precisely in that point where he finds his peace. And I think that this is also related to Ephesians 6, where it talks about putting on the armor of God. Again, sort of a militant idea. But what Paul says there is that the battle is not against flesh and blood, but against every principality and power of this present world. Our battle is never against another person. Our battle is always against the enemy, who is Satan. Not any person, no matter what ideology they have, what religion they may practice. They are never the enemy. And Francis learned that in his own flesh when he bore the wounds of Christ. So Francis' whole conversion, his whole life, is a movement from war to peace, from riches to poverty. He moves from violence to harmony. And this happened in Christ and through his poverty for Francis. Francis could befriend the leper because he gave away his personal preference and his personal revulsion. He could befriend the Sultan because he gave away the cultural prejudices that would have painted him as, the enemy or as a monster, someone to fight. He could befriend even the brothers who usurped his role in community and tossed out the rule he gave them. He could befriend the whole world because he who had been rich made himself poor so that all of us might share in his riches in imitation of Christ. This is just like Jesus, who, though he was one with God, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but emptied himself. And I think this is a ministry of reconciliation that we can all work towards in our lives. This emptiness of preference, this emptiness of prejudice, this emptiness of things to defend, both physical things, but more importantly, probably, the things of the heart. And so I just invite all of us maybe to reflect on the pierced side of Christ in Francis as an icon of peace in a way that we can approach the things that we perhaps have seen as enemies or threats.
My name is Mark Danner, and I have given my life over the last 40 years for the encounter with the other, specifically in Islam and with Muslims around the world. So I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about St. Francis's encounter with Sultan Malik al Kamil. And you may say, well, it happened in 1219. What does that have to do with today? I mean, what does an event that happened so many centuries ago communicate to today? And I've actually given a lot of thought to that question. And I've questioned a lot of authors and other persons about that. And here's what really comes to my mind. If you look at St. Francis's life before he crossed those battle lines, and these were some of the toughest battle lines in the world. I mean, this is the Fifth Crusade. The city of Damietta, Egypt, had been under siege for months. When the Crusaders finally went into the city, it was filled with thousands of dead bodies. I mean, it was of a brutality you can't imagine. So there was war at the time, the sister mentioned. We face war today as well. So Francis crossed the battle lines to the great disapproval of the Crusaders, who said, you're going to get yourself killed. He brought another brother with him, and they walked to the battle lines of what were called the Moors at the time, but actually, to be correct, it was the Ayyubid troops, and he was welcomed. And he didn't spend a few hours with the Sultan. He actually probably spent many days, who knows, maybe a week or so. So Francis brought a characteristic that I value very much in him, and I like to model, I hope, in some small way, in addition to the self-emptying that Sister spoke about, and that is of wonder. I've seen again and again in the lives of the saints, in the lives of my friends today, how a position of fascination, curiosity, desire to know the other, unlocks new knowledge and new horizon. So I'm pretty sure that before St. Francis crossed those battle lines, he probably would have failed a test that I like to give to others. Probably could even give it to you. And the test is two parts. The first part is, could you name me 5 to 10 things, events that you have seen in what you perceive as Islam and in the lives of Muslims that really trouble you, that shock you, that horrify you? I don't think St. Francis would have a problem writing that down. You know, questions of Jerusalem and battles and this and that, questions of the Quran and Muhammad and this and that. Okay, so now turn your paper over. I'm going to ask you to write 5 to 10 things that you perceive about Islam and Muslims that fill you with wonder, amazement, that really move you. I don't think until St. Francis met the Sultan he could have answered that. But then when we look at his life, after he crossed back from those battle lines, you also have to be a little bit of a detective here. I think this is very interesting. You have to be a bit of an investigator. And you know, there are differences of opinion, but I think if you put the pieces together like a Sherlock Holmes and you say, this has got to have been an event that fundamentally impacted his life. What are some of those changes that we see in Francis that are so indicative of being touched by a Muslim, by the spirituality of Islam? One of them, which I find very important, is how his rule, he wrote a new rule, the first Franciscan rule, in which he provides for 2 ways to go about witnessing to Christ. One of the ways is to proclaim the Word of God, so that the unbelievers might believe in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Pretty standard practice for religious order. But then he provided for another way, which was very unusual for the time, those Middle Ages, and that was to avoid quarrels or disputes and be subject to every human creature for God's sake. That is probably a way that he realized was the way of silent witness that is most persuasive among Muslims. We also look at how he composed a beautiful prayer, the praises of God. If you have a chance, have some fun with this. Go home and on Google Images, search for the words St. Francis and Chartula, Chartula, which is this parchment document in which he composed his praises of God, prayer. And then if you flip it over on the other side, he has a kind of form of a cross. It's really like a tau, a T. And then if you can get a good image of it, there's a little kind of something he did at the bottom of that T. And scholars have looked at it. I looked at it. I finally could see what scholars have described as an image, probably of the Sultan Malik al Kamil. It's turned sideways, so if you see all those little points, that's his beard. And once you know what you're looking for, you will see it, okay? And you'll see his nose, his turban. Very interesting that St. Francis would be so moved on this parchment to write the image to draw the image of the Sultan. But the prayer itself, the prayer of praises to God, uses language that draws, other very wise scholars have said, that draw from the Islamic prayers, the Islamic praises of God's 99 names. And it's actually worth putting the two side by side, and you can start saying, oh wow, the all-merciful, the just, etc., etc. We also know that St. Francis was deeply, deeply moved by the violence and the horror that he saw in the war, and so he absolutely did not support the ongoing crusades. And some of the great Catholic scholars who've devoted their lives to studying this encounter and that helped shape their own lives really actually put forth a pretty bold hypothesis. Maybe we can wait until the afterlife to see if it's true, but that when St. Francis suffered the stigmata, these marks in his body, the marks of Christ's love that Sister described. In many ways, that was a martyrdom in sacrifice for his friend, the Sultan, and the Muslims that he met. So while he was not martyred in their camp, Christ gave him another martyrdom and a new offering. So what's that have to do with today? Well, flash forward to the 1930s. The scene is the city of Damietta. It's a quiet church in the town. And there in that church is a modern-day St. Francis, a man who I would call myself a disciple of, Father Louis Massignon. At that time, one of the leading scholars of Islam, one of the greatest Catholic minds in Europe, a friend of so many great Catholics, and Cardinal Montini, the future Pope Paul VI. Louis Massignon was there in that church with a friend of his, Mary Cahill, and they made a consecration before the altar in the spirit of St. Francis and decided to devote their whole lives to an offering, a self-offering, a quiet offering, for the sake that their lives could be a witness to Muslims. And he began a sodality, a group that was recognized by the Vatican that continues to this day. Many of us offer our very prayers every day that we could be witnesses in the same way that St. Francis was to the Sultan, in the same way that Louis Massignon was to an entire generation of some of the greatest Muslim minds throughout the entire Islamic world, to be a witness. Not so much in function of, hey, I need to convert you, but I want to share with you what burns my heart, what really makes me so full of wonder, and that is this encounter I've had with Christ, who is the fullness of life. And if you look at the life of Louis Massignon, who's hardly known in the US, but who shaped over 50 years probably every single aspect of Muslim-Christian dialogue in Europe and the Middle East. If you look at his life, it's very, very relevant to today. And Louis Massignon's followers, both Muslim and Christian, have had a tremendous impact. For example, you're all familiar with some of the revolutionary wording in the Second Vatican Council's writings about Islam. That Islam is held in respect, that we are of Abrahamic lineage, tracing our roots back to Abraham. That wording was very revolutionary if you read it. And the priests, the cardinals, the bishops who put that together, many of them were very, very close to Louis Massignon. You can trace that lineage very clearly. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to him. That's on the Christian side. But if you look on the Muslim side, there's also a fascinating line of descent. This time not so much from St. Francis, but from the Sultan. The Sultan lived and ruled at a time where Islam was in its flowering in terms of its deepest spirituality, in terms of the mystical Sufi side of Islam. And one of the characteristics of the Sultan's spiritual life that went right into the military side of things was the way he treated prisoners. Now, this is a no-holds-barred war, and crusaders were captured. And what do you think is their fate when they're captured by these bloodthirsty Muslims? Well, let me read you what Oliver of Cologne, a Crusader preacher and later a bishop and a cardinal, said in a letter concerning the feeding of 30,000 Crusaders who were captured by the Sultan and who were dying of hunger. He said, "I, your freed prisoner, your servant redeemed on the cross, I will never be ungrateful for your kindness. Never before has there ever been cited such examples of goodness in regard to enemy prisoners. When the Lord permitted that we fall into your hands, we did not have the impression of being in the empire of a tyrant or master, but under the authority of a Father who has showered us with good deeds." It's a beautiful example of a man who lived the Islamic law. I mean, today when we hear the word Sharia, it strikes fear in our hearts, but actually this is an example of Sharia. So let's flash forward, just as we did with Louis Massignon to that little church in Damietta. Let's flash forward to the 1860s, centuries later, but another brutal, bloody battle, this time for the occupation of Algeria. And the French colonialists have come into Algeria with their cannons, their guns, their troops, and they're systematically moving through the country, taking over cities, leveling them if there's any resistance. And it is truly one of the terrible wars of the 1800s. Fighting them is a great Muslim leader, an Emir Abdul Qadir, who became legendary because of his brave fight against the French. In fact, he was known all over the West. He was known here in the United States. Abdul Qadir's life, in many ways, images so many of the virtues of the Sultan centuries before. I could give you many, many examples. In fact, I learned a lot about him last weekend, because at this time last weekend, I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at a conference celebrating the life of Emir Abdul Qadir, not by Muslims, not by Arabs, but by Americans. There's a whole association, the Abdul Qadir Education Project. There's a city in Iowa called Elkader, Iowa, named after Emir Abdul Qadir. What's so great about this guy? I mean, he fought the French, you know, they're the West, he's the East. I mean, well, what you see in his life is a man who was a man of faith, reason, virtue, magnanimity. Two stories. One is when he captured French prisoners, just like at the time of the Sultan. He treated them with the utmost of respect. So much so that years later, after he laid down his arms and surrendered, his stories were echoed throughout Europe. And in the late 1860s, forget the exact date, 3 men in Geneva, Switzerland met, 3 Europeans, and they started talking about their hopes for Europe. And one of them said, you know, I've heard a lot about Emir Abdul Qadir. I've heard how he treated prisoners, how he was so good and noble to them. You know, I think we should start an organization that helps others internationally, that involves treating those who are in trouble and distress. Let's call it the International Red Cross. And in fact, it's so important that prisoners be treated well. Let's propose this new idea of how prisoners should be treated. Let's call it the Geneva Convention. So you see, Emir Abdul Qadir had a huge impact. But it didn't stop there, because his view of the law, of the need to respect all men equally, became a very dramatic call years later when he was in quiet retirement, praying at the mosque every day. Students would come study Sufism under him. When he heard word that in Damascus, which had a very large Christian neighborhood, a number of Muslims were becoming very embittered towards the Christians for their failure to pay taxes, whispering, complaining, and then accusations. And the Turkish ruler of Damascus at the time turned a blind eye. So Abdul Qadir went to the French and Italian consuls and said, you know, trouble's brewing. They said, it's not a problem, we'll be fine. He said, no, I'm hearing real big trouble's brewing. We'll be fine. So on his own, he gathered his Algerian veterans, asked for some weapons from the Europeans there, who gave him some, and prepared to defend the Christians of Damascus. And indeed, the day came when the mobs rose up and began sacking, pillaging, and killing in those neighborhoods. And who was in the front lines in those battles? Abdul Qadir, telling all the Christians, come with me, come to my house. He had a huge compound. And he sheltered them. It's estimated that he saved over 10,000 Christians' lives. So you see this notion of sacrifice, of respect for the other, continues down through the centuries. And the model, whether it's of St. Francis or of the Sultan, is as true today as it was then. I would just like to close with a story from last December, which moves me very much. And it wasn't a very famous man, but it was a simple Muslim named Salah Farah. You can even Google his image. You can see a handsome Kenyan man who was on a bus along with other passengers driving through Kenya, when all of a sudden out of the bush popped the Al-Shabaab terrorists. These are these terrorists modeled on ISIS who are traumatizing Kenya and Somalia. And immediately Salah knew what was going to happen. And the Christians on the bus knew also. This is it. We're dead. And Salah turned to all the passengers before the driver opened the door and told the Muslims, are we going to be together on this? We will not identify what religion we are, okay? And the Muslims agreed. And the Muslim women on the bus took off their hijabs and started giving it to the Christian women. And so when Shabab pulled them all to the bus, the Shabab said, Christians to the left, Muslims to the right. And Salah Farah said, sorry, we're not going to do it. I said, you crazy? You all want to die? I said, we're not going to do it. We're in this together. And the argument proceeded, and Shabab didn't get anywhere with it. He held his ground, and in the end, they shot him in the stomach. He survived. They shot one other person, but then they fled. And from his hospital bed, he said something very beautiful. He said, I asked my brother Muslims to take care of the Christians so that Christians can take care of us. Tragically, an infection set in, and Salah Farah died a month later. So he died just late December last year. But I just wanted to give you some of these names. And I have so many more. I literally could be here for hours giving you name after name of Catholics, other Christians, of Muslims, so that now when you leave this tent tonight, if you get the test, can you name 5 things that move you, or even a few things about Muslims you can recall? Emir Abdul Qadir, or Salah Farah, or the Sultan, who treated prisoners the way nobody was treating them at the time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is something very nice as an introduction to what I'm going to say. But I'm really honored and delighted to be here. My name is Imam Bashar Arafat, happily who drove 4 hours, 5 hours to be with you and to see these shiny faces. But I came 26 years ago from Damascus, Syria, waiting for this event. So I'm really delighted to be here. This is my first time. coming to this wonderful town. And I'm also delighted to see the Franciscan University, because I have a lot of things to share with you in these few minutes about my experience with Saint Francis and the Sultan. But just briefly, I would like to say, it is so sad that today CNN and the whole corporate media is not interested with the Sultan and Saint Francis. They are interested with Al-Shabaab, they are interested with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, and what's going on. But a gathering like this, really, that's not of an interest. But if a bomb will go somewhere here or there, the whole world will know about it. I'm saying that just for you to know that for me, as somebody who read the Quran, follow the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Prophet Jesus, Moses, Abraham, the 25 prophets mentioned in the Quran, I see that Jesus is part of my identity of who I am. Moses is part of my identity of who I am. If I don't follow on the footsteps of Mary, Zechariah, John, and the whole biblical prophets, that means I'm not a true, the Quran is saying a believer, because Muslim means a believer. If I'm not like that, then the Quran is calling me a hypocrite, which my sister here called it a committed love and empty love. So we have a lot of hypocrisy today. People call themselves Muslims, but they might not really do what they are supposed to do. People call themselves Christians, but really they don't follow truly on the footsteps of Jesus and all the prophets. I'm not sure if all of you know that Jesus is mentioned in the Quran 25 times. And there is a long chapter called Mary, where the full detailed story of Jesus' birth from the beginning to the end is mentioned in the Quran. And the Quran spoke about Mary more than the 4 Gospels combined, just for your information. Because unfortunately, the media is not interested about what brings us closer together, because we have more than 90 to 95% of similarities. And we have some theological differences, which the Quran clearly told Prophet Muhammad, God is telling the Prophet, do not enter this area of theological differences and let it become an explosive area where people will kill one another. No, you talk about it and then you go to have dinner together and lunch together. Because some people, they don't know how to talk about the differences. They think differences means I hate you and you hate me. No, the Quran is saying differences are there, and people within the same family, this is the same mother, the same father, and 4 brothers and sisters, and everybody has different opinions, right? You want to go or you don't want to go? You want us to buy these shoes or you don't want us to buy that shoe? People have different opinions, different tastes, different interpretations. So the Quran, Almighty spoke about this and taught us that learn from all of these legendaries who walked on the surface of this earth, men and women. So for me, coming to the United States, I have never heard of the Sultan and Saint Francis. This is something I just would like to mention it quickly here today. The first time I heard about this, even though I lived in Damascus all of my life, I studied in the Sharia University, it was with the Grand Mufti. The first time it was in in Denver, Colorado. I'm saying Cleveland because my in-laws are in Cleveland all the time. But Denver, Colorado, in 1996, there was a grant from Lilly Foundation for professors from the Muslims and the Christians for 3 years to meet and talk about the Sultan and Saint Francis. When I heard about this, then I decided to have my PhD also focusing also on the Sultan and Saint Francis. The reason I'm saying all of that, because today, if you will tell a lot of scholars in the Middle East, what do you know about the Sultan and Saint Francis? They will tell you, we know nothing. Because I started calling some of my friends who graduated from the Sharia University, by the way, what do you know about the Sultan and Saint Francis? Who? All what we know is the Franciscans. We have a lot of Franciscan missions in the Middle East. But we have never really read about the Sultan, because the Middle East these days is burned by the French colonialism, British colonialism, and the Israeli Palestinians, and then now Iraq and now Afghanistan. So really, there is a lot of things for the Franciscan University to do, to separate the wonderful legacy of Saint Francis from the Franciscans of today, who have wonderful heart, but the people in the Middle East view them as part of the Western agenda to do all kind of wishy-washy work, okay? But actually they are guided by the wonderful life of Saint Francis. But Saint Francis, for me, now, when I talk about that topic, I talk from the perspective of the Sultan, because normally you hear always about Saint Francis and the Sultan, Saint Francis and the Sultan, but you don't hear about the Sultan and Saint Francis. And you don't hear about what did he experience there. He was his guest for several days. We talk and we read the stories. But what does it mean for you to walk on the footsteps of Saint Francis and go and live with somebody who will imitate the Sultan? So let me just share with you quickly. Saint Francis is coming with his intention to convert the Sultan. The Sultan is acting based on the teachings of the Quran that he has to honor the guest. So he's welcoming him and whoever with him. And the Sultan is praying 5 times a day. And before each salah, we have adhan, call for prayer. In Rome, back then, in 1219, there was no call for prayer. So now Saint Francis is hosted by the Sultan, and he is hearing the following. I'm going to share with you what Saint Francis heard, okay? So you will have that experience. In order to know what kind of things impacted Saint Francis when he went back to Rome, and why today the Franciscans are walking on the footsteps of this man who was impacted by what he heard and what he saw. So, he is walking into the presence of the Sultan, and it's the time for sunset prayer, or afternoon prayer, or noon prayer, and this is what he is going to hear. The call for prayer. He has never heard the call for prayer. What is the call for prayer? 4 times, Allahu Akbar. Allah is the greatest. God is the greatest in this universe. God is the greatest of any problems you have. I do believe that there is no God but Allah. Twice. And I do believe that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Rush lively for prayers twice. Rush lively for success twice. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, God is the greatest. There is no God but God. But he heard it this way. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala al-falah. Hayya ala al-falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. This is what he heard as soon as he arrived. And then almost 2 hours later, 3 hours later, the same call for prayer. And then before the end of the night, the same call for prayer. In the morning, he wake up to hear the same thing. At noon, 5 times. What does it mean? It gives you a sense of tranquility that you have to leave everything, all the talk, all the discussion with the Sultan, and let's go for prayer. And then after they eat and have lunch, let's go for prayer. The other thing he has heard over there and he saw, everywhere he goes, and everybody who will enter to the presence of the Sultan, Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. The response is, Wa alaikum assalam. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum. Everywhere he goes, Assalamu alaikum. And Assalam, peace be with you, is the name of God. As you know, we have 99 names of attributes of God. One of them is Assalam, the peace. He was, wow. He came back. One of the things you can read about what he shared with his disciples later on is the concept of peace. Because it was amazing experience. From what I have read, 3 years after he came back, he died. He died kind of early. But that kind of experience really transformed him, because he had all kind of thoughts about the Muslims. But when he went there, and when he met with the Sultan who welcomed him, because some, they warned him, don't go, you will be killed, he didn't listen, and he went through all of these lines of threats. Both the Muslims, the soldiers here and the soldiers there, no, I'm coming to meet with the Sultan. How many Americans today, if they heard the word Islam and Muslims, those are terrorists, they want to kill us, they want to do this, they want to do that. But really, when you visit and when you meet and when you interact, you will see a completely different story. Today, That's what I tell the students who come from all over the world, and I work with cultural exchange students in the Washington area. I tell them, I want you to take back home to the Philippines and to Indonesia and Thailand and 66 countries. I want you to take back something that in America we appreciate diversity and we respect diversity. Yes, we have some people who don't want to step outside of their comfort zone. But for me, the story of Saint Francis and his commitment to go and accept those challenges that he might be killed, and then to be welcomed by somebody who gave him access to the whole Middle East, because today the Franciscan missions in Jordan, in the Holy Land, in Egypt, in Syria, everywhere, those are part of the legacy of Saint Francis. My question to all of you, what is your legacy? That was Saint Francis. Okay, Saint Francis, now he is enjoying the blessings and the peace in the home of peace in heaven. But what about you, sweetheart? What are you going to do? What is your message of peace? Do you truly love Jesus? Show me in actions. Do you truly love Saint Francis and his way? Show me in action. To me today, that's what I'm doing in Baltimore. Guided by this legacy of Saint Francis and the Sultan. So I would like to bring back this legacy today, in 2016 and 17. Throughout the whole drive here, I'm talking with my brother about different possibilities and different projects that we could do, and some of the things I'm already doing. And I shared with him how I started Civilizations Exchange and Cooperation Foundation, the whole story for another event of you are a good for me. That's why I'm here. Just to let you know that Saint Francis and the Sultan has to live until the day of judgment. That's what I took from this story in the 90s. And now I'm trying to make it as a course to teach my fellow imams in other countries that look at these great legacies of others, because some people, they think they are the only right and everybody is wrong. Have you met some people like that? I'm talking about the Muslim community, okay? I'm not talking about you. But I know some Muslims, they think they are the only right and everybody is going to hell. And thank God that hell and heaven is in the hands of God only, by the way, not anybody else. But what I wanted to share with you here in this wonderful town, in these blessed moments, that you need to ask yourself when you go back home today, what is my legacy? And how I'm going to reach out to the people who represent the Sultan of today. Because Ohio has a lot of Muslims who are impacted by the political rhetoric today. And we have a lot of Christians who are impacted by the political rhetoric and what they are seeing as if the whole Islam is ISIS and Al-Shabaab. Those are criminals. Do you have some criminals within the Christian faith? Do you? Are you sure? Because the media does not tell me that this one who killed his wife is a Catholic. And this one who killed her husband, she is a Protestant. But if he is Muhammad and Ahmad and Abdullah, or she is a Muslim, this is right away a terrorist, and this is right away terrorism, extremism, violence. Those are Muslims. You know, Islamic terrorism and Islamic this and Islamic that. Excuse me, I cannot say Christian terrorism, because this is not right. There are some bad Christians, there are some criminal Christians, but that's not what Jesus taught. I have a lot of things to share with you, but I will leave it for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
maybe I'll just close with a few words because we're over time. But just an observation. I was struck by Sister Agnes Thérèse's expression of self-emptying and how that is a proposal for my life that takes on a real possibility when you see it in the life of what in Arabic is called a shaheed, a witness. St. Francis is a witness to this self-emptying. It takes a lot of self-emptying as well for a Muslim commander to welcome the other, as we saw in the Sultan's virtues in his life. And I would love to see the fruits that are planted under this tent today to grow in some way. That's in God's hands. But I'll tell you one thing, coming up in the car with Imam Bashar, what he's doing is, in my experience and what I've seen, having been on the front lines of the battle, what he's doing is epic. I mean, in his work, he's bringing imams, religious leaders from the Islamic world to the U.S. to see, taste, and hear life in this country. Student exchange programs as well, young Muslim boys and girls. Maybe we could talk afterwards about some of these imams coming to Steubenville and a visit soon to the Franciscan University. Because in my experience, only when you step across the battle lines and meet the other does a new possibility for going beyond rhetoric or jargon or simple words like dialogue and all, where it becomes really concrete, where it becomes encounter, and where you can really say, not in an abstract way, but in a true way, the other is a good for me, and we see that. We see that here. So I hope we can continue the discussion, the friendship, maybe plant some seeds and see where it goes in God's hands. Thanks.